November 12, 1940. Occupied France. Oberst Franz Helder sat alone in his coastal headquarters, reviewing intelligence reports by candlelight. The documents described British soldiers materializing from darkness, demolishing installations, then vanishing before reinforcements arrived. He scrawled one word across the page: unglitch. Impossible. Helder filed the report away, convinced it was a light propaganda designed to boost morale after Dunkirk's humiliation. German military doctrine had no framework for understanding what Britain was creating. The Wehrmacht built its victories on massed formations, overwhelming firepower, and territorial conquest. Blitzkrieg had steamrolled Poland, France, and the Low Countries in months. Why would any rational power waste resources training small groups for pinprick raids when conventional armies could conquer entire nations? Yet in that moment, as Helder dismissed the reports, he failed to grasp a devastating truth: Britain wasn't just surviving defeat. It was inventing something the Germans couldn't comprehend: warriors who would transform mythology into Germany's nightmare. The evacuation at Dunkirk ended on June 4, 1940. Britain saved 338,000 men, but left behind virtually everything that made them an army. 700 tanks, 20,000 motorcycles, 64,000 vehicles, enough artillery to equip 8 divisions. All of it rested on French beaches while Hitler's forces controlled Europe from Norway to the Pyrenees. Winston Churchill understood what his generals couldn't accept. Britain had lost the conventional war. The nation possessed neither the equipment nor the manpower to challenge Germany through traditional military doctrine. So, on the same day Dunkirk's evacuation concluded, Churchill circulated a memo that shocked the military establishment. He demanded the formation of units that could conduct butcher and bolt raids along occupied Europe's coastline. Traditional British military thinking emphasized fair play, honorable combat, and established rules of warfare. Churchill was proposing something altogether different: ungentlemanly warfare conducted by men who'd strike from darkness, kill efficiently, and vanish before enemy response arrived. It violated every principle taught at Sandhurst and contradicted centuries of British military tradition. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark received the directive to make Churchill's vision reality. On June 14, 1940, he submitted proposals for commando units, deliberately borrowing the term from Boer guerrillas who tormented British forces 40 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on military traditionalists. Britain would now embrace what it had once condemned as barbaric. The War Office approved Clark's proposals within days. Churchill wanted raiders harassing occupied territories immediately. If Britain couldn't defend itself conventionally, it would make occupation so costly that German planners might hesitate before attempting invasion. Small groups of exceptionally trained men could achieve strategic effects impossible for conventional forces. Britain was abandoning centuries of doctrine, and desperation made the decision easier. By August 1940, the first commando units were forming from volunteers across the British Army. They had no proper training facilities, minimal equipment, and doctrine that consisted largely of improvisation. What they possessed was Churchill's backing, strategic necessity, and men willing to die proving defeat wasn't final. The Norwegian fishing ports of Stamsund, Svolvær, Henningsvær, and Bredesens seemed impossibly remote in early March 1941. 500 miles from Britain, deep within Arctic waters Germany controlled, these villages supplied 40% of the glycerin Germany needed for explosives production. Destroy those factories and Wehrmacht ammunition output would collapse. Commandos No. 3 and No. 4, totaling 500 men under Brigadier John Durnford Slater, departed Scapa Flow on March 1, 1941. The journey required navigating waters patrolled by U-boats and within range of Luftwaffe bases. Standard military wisdom held that inserting troops this deep into enemy territory guaranteed catastrophic losses. The commandos spent the voyage rehearsing landing procedures and memorizing factory locations from reconnaissance photographs. Dawn on March 4th brought the raiders to Vestfjord's icy waters. Norwegian locals watching from shoreline cottages saw landing craft materializing through morning mist like ghost ships. The commandos hit beaches at 4 locations simultaneously, moving with precision that stunned German garrison troops. At Stamsund, Durnford Slater's men overwhelmed defenders before anyone could raise an alarm. Factory workers arriving from morning shifts found British soldiers methodically placing explosive charges throughout facilities they'd assumed were safely beyond enemy reach. The destruction proceeded with industrial efficiency. 18 fish oil factories vanished in coordinated explosions. 800,000 gallons of glycerin raw material lost in minutes. Commandos systematically demolished cold storage facilities, destroyed merchant shipping totaling 20,000 tons, and captured encryption equipment from German radio stations. Norwegian Quisling collaborators, who'd profited from occupation, found themselves prisoners alongside Wehrmacht soldiers. The raiders moved through objectives like clockwork, each team knowing precisely what to destroy and how long they had before withdrawal. What stunned German commanders wasn't just the destruction. It was the precision. These weren't random saboteurs or desperate partisans. The raiders demonstrated military professionalism that indicated systematic training and careful planning. They'd struck 4 locations simultaneously, accomplished every objective, and prepared for evacuation while German forces were still comprehending what had occurred. The human intelligence proved equally valuable. 314 Norwegian volunteers evacuated with the commandos, men whose skills in fishing and navigation would prove invaluable to Britain's Norwegian operations. Additionally, 215 German prisoners, including several officers, were taken aboard destroyers. The Abwehr analysts who dismissed commando reports as propaganda now had German soldiers describing British raiders who'd appeared from nowhere, destroyed strategic infrastructure, then vanished. The casualty figures demolished German assumptions completely. Over 10 hours of operations deep in occupied territory, commandos suffered exactly 1 man wounded. 1. German garrison forces, caught utterly unprepared, couldn't mount effective resistance before raiders had completed objectives and withdrawn. Berlin's reaction shifted from dismissal to alarm. These weren't myths or isolated incidents. Britain had created highly trained raiders capable of striking anywhere along Europe's coastline, destroying strategic assets, and withdrawing before Wehrmacht response could engage them. Germany's comfortable certainty that Britain was defeated suddenly seemed far less certain. The notice appeared on battalion boards throughout the British Army in summer 1940. Volunteers required for special service. No details. No promises. Just an invitation for soldiers seeking something beyond standard military routine. Officers warned that acceptance meant forfeiting rank. The posting offered no glory, no guarantees, and explicitly stated that many volunteers would be returned to their original units as unsuitable. Thousands applied anyway. They were drawn by the phrase hazardous duty and the prospect of fighting rather than enduring garrison monotony. What they encountered at the Commando Basic Training Center at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands redefined their understanding of military service entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan commanded Achnacarry from February 1942. Vaughan understood that conventional military training produced conventional soldiers. Commandos required something altogether different. Men who could function when exhausted, improvise when plans collapsed, and kill without hesitation when necessary. His training philosophy embraced a brutal truth: better men fail in Scotland than die in occupied Europe. The 70% washout rate reflected this mercilessness. Volunteers arriving at Achnacarry found no welcoming committee. They stepped off trains at St Bridge station and immediately began a 7-mile speed march to the castle, fully laden with equipment. Instructors shadowed them in lorries, bellowing abuse and noting any man who struggled. Everything at Achnacarry was assessment. Every meal, every night's sleep, every moment existed to identify who possessed the physical capacity, mental resilience, and temperament for commando operations. The physical standards defied conventional military fitness expectations. Commandos completed 30-mile force marches carrying 70 pounds of equipment across highland terrain, finishing within 8 hours, regardless of weather. Men practiced cliff climbing until their hands bled, then climbed again. They learned to swim in full kit through frigid Scottish locks because operations might require swimming a mile from submarine to shore. The course demanded capabilities most soldiers never developed, not because they lacked courage, but because standard military service never required such extremes. Silent killing training occurred at the death house, where instructors taught techniques borrowed from Shanghai police forces and refined through brutal practicality. Commandos learned to approach sentries from behind, kill with knives in seconds, and continue moving without breaking stride. This wasn't sport fencing or martial arts demonstration. Instructors emphasized speed, simplicity, and absolute finality. Navigation training assumed commandos would operate without maps, compasses, or daylight. Instructors dumped volunteers in the highlands at midnight with instructions to reach a specific location by dawn, using only stars for navigation. Men learned to read terrain through touch, estimate distances by counting paces, and maintain direction sense even when disoriented. Live ammunition permeated every exercise. Instructors fired machine guns over crawling commandos, detonated explosives near advancing troops, and deliberately created chaos that simulated combat conditions. Men who froze under fire washed out immediately. The approach was dangerous. Several trainees died during training, but Vaughan accepted those casualties as necessary. Better men died learning to handle fire than froze during actual operations where their paralysis would kill entire teams. Achnacarry didn't just build warriors, it rebuilt men's understanding of what warfare could be. The psychological transformation mattered as much as physical capabilities. Commandos learned that rules were guidelines, plans were suggestions, and achieving the objective justified whatever methods worked. This represented fundamental departure from standard military thinking. Conventional doctrine emphasized following orders precisely and maintaining rigid discipline. Commandos needed initiative, adaptability, and willingness to abandon doctrine when circumstances demanded. They emerged from Achnacarry understanding that warfare wasn't about following rules, it was about winning regardless of cost. The Normandy dry dock at St Nazaire represented Germany's single most valuable maritime asset on the Atlantic coast. Measuring 350 meters long and 50 meters wide, it was the only facility between Hamburg and the Mediterranean capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz. If the 42,000-ton Tirpitz sortied into the Atlantic and sustained damage, St Nazaire was her only available refuge. Destroy the dock, and Kriegsmarine's most powerful vessel became strategically useless, unable to risk Atlantic operations without guaranteed repair facilities. Combined operations planned to eliminate it, using a method so audacious that German defenders would never anticipate it. Hum's Campbelltown had served the United States Navy as USS Buchanan before Britain acquired her through the destroyer's four bases agreement. By March 1942, the aged vessel was obsolete for fleet operations, but perfect for combined operations requirements. Engineers spent weeks modifying her into a floating bomb, welding 24 tons of depth charges into a steel-encased compartment within her bow. The explosives were configured with delayed action fuses set to detonate hours after impact, giving commandos time to withdraw. Theoretically, Campbelltown's superstructure was cut down to resemble German M2-class torpedo boats, a deception that might buy precious minutes approaching St Nazaire's heavily defended harbor. Commander Robert Ryder commanded the naval force, while Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman led No. 2 Commandos assault teams. The plan required sailing up the Loire estuary directly into German guns, ramming Campbelltown into the Normandy dock's caisson at maximum speed, then holding the dock area long enough for demolition teams to destroy pumping stations and machinery. Conventional military assessment rated the mission's survival probability near zero. Commandos loaded aboard motor launches on March 26, 1942, knowing most wouldn't return. The flotilla reached the Loire's mouth after midnight on March 28, flying German naval ensigns while approaching St Nazaire's harbor. Searchlights illuminated them at 1 in the morning, and German signalers challenged their identification. A German-speaking sailor aboard Campbelltown transmitted plausible responses that bought minutes of confusion. The deception collapsed when shore batteries opened fire at point-blank range. Ryder ordered white ensigns raised if they died. They die under British colors, and Campbelltown surged forward through a maelstrom of shellfire. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty drove Campbelltown directly into the Normandy docks caisson at 18 knots. The impact at 1:34 crushed the destroyer's bow precisely where 24 tons of explosives waited on delayed fuses. Commandos poured ashore immediately, fighting through German defenders toward demolition objectives. Teams systematically destroyed pumping equipment, winding machinery, and dock operating systems, while German reinforcements converged from all directions. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat through dock facilities and surrounding buildings. Newman's commandos held German forces at bay for 90 minutes, while demolition teams completed their work. Casualties mounted horrifically as Wehrmacht troops brought up heavy weapons and sealed escape routes. Motor launches attempting to evacuate survivors faced concentrated fire. Most were destroyed or driven off. Of the 611 men who'd sailed from Falmouth, only 228 returned to Britain. 169 were killed and 214 captured. By any conventional metric, the raid was catastrophic failure. Then at noon on March 28, Campbelltown exploded. German officers had been conducting tour of the mysteriously abandoned destroyer, showing curious soldiers and French dock workers the British wreckage. The delayed fuses triggered 24 tons of explosives simultaneously. The blast vaporized everyone near the ship, killed an estimated 360 German soldiers and French collaborators, and utterly destroyed the Normandy docks caisson and operating machinery. The facility wouldn't return to service until 1948. The strategic calculus was undeniable. Britain had sacrificed hundreds of commandos to eliminate Germany's only Atlantic facility capable of servicing Tirpitz. The battleship never risked Atlantic operations, spending the war bottled in Norwegian fjords where RAF bombers eventually destroyed her in November 1944. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for St Nazaire, the highest proportion for any single battle in the Second World War. Wehrmacht commanders could no longer dismiss commandos as myths. These men would die to accomplish objectives, and their deaths achieved strategic effects no conventional operation could match. Adolf Hitler's rage manifested in a document that would become one of the Third Reich's most infamous orders. On October 18, 1942, for Hauptquartier issued Directive No. 18, officially titled Befehl über Behandlung von Sabotage and Terrorkommandos, the order concerning the treatment of sabotage and terror commandos. The directive abandoned all pretense of adhering to international law. Captured commandos, regardless of uniform, rank, or circumstances of capture, were to be slaughtered to the last man. No trials, no prisoner status, immediate execution. The Geneva Convention protections Britain and Germany had theoretically respected simply ceased to exist for this category of soldier. The order's language revealed Hitler's psychological state. He didn't describe commandos as enemy soldiers conducting military operations. He called them saboteurs and terrorists operating outside the laws of war. The directive claimed these raiders threatened to exterminate German troops through Bolshevik methods, a propagandistic characterization that justified abandoning legal constraints. Yet beneath the inflammatory rhetoric lay transparent admission: commandos terrified the Führer. Operations like St Nazaire, where tiny forces accomplished what bomber wings couldn't, demonstrated that Germany's Atlantic Wall couldn't protect strategic assets from determined raiders. The commando order specifically targeted what made these operations effective. Commandos wearing British uniforms, carrying proper identification, and conducting legitimate military operations would be executed as criminals. Hitler's rage stemmed from helplessness. He couldn't prevent the raids, couldn't defend thousands of miles of European coastline, and couldn't accept that Britain's defeated military was destroying German infrastructure systematically. Field Marshal Will Keitel distributed the order throughout German forces on October 19 with explicit instructions that it applied universally, including commandos, capture during combat while in uniform. This violated the Hague Conventions so blatantly that several Wehrmacht commanders refused initial compliance. Berlin's response was unambiguous: execute all commandos immediately. When British and Norwegian commandos raided the Glomfjord power station in Norway during September 1942, German forces captured several raiders. Under established international law, these prisoners should have been interned for the war's duration. Instead, Gestapo firing squads executed them in October, immediately following Hitler's directive. The pattern repeated across occupied Europe. Commandos taken prisoner simply disappeared into execution chambers. Yet Hitler's order contained fatal irony. By explicitly targeting commandos for execution, the Führer had officially acknowledged they existed and were strategically significant. Every execution under the commando order proved that these myths had become the Third Reich's nightmare. The directive also served Allied propaganda brilliantly. German willingness to execute uniformed prisoners violated international law so obviously that neutral nations couldn't ignore it. Commandos captured after October 1940 understood their fate. Operation Miskatoon survivors taken at Glomfjord were executed. Operation Basalt's prisoners from the Channel Islands raid met firing squads. Operation Frankton's canoeists captured after attacking Bordeaux shipping were shot. The list grew throughout 1943 and 1944. Yet commando volunteers didn't decrease, they increased. Men queued to join units that faced not just combat death but execution if captured. That willingness to accept such risks demonstrated that Britain had created something unprecedented: warriors who'd embraced near certain death to accomplish strategic objectives. Hitler's order hadn't deterred them, it had validated their importance. The first Allied soldiers to engage German forces on June 6, 1944, weren't landing from the sea. At 16 minutes past midnight, 6 Horsa gliders descended through darkness stored to bridges spanning the Caen Canal and Orne River. Major John Howard's men had minutes to capture both bridges intact before German demolition teams could destroy them. The lead glider touched down at 0:16. Commandos poured out before it stopped moving, charging German positions. Lieutenant Dan Brotheridge led the assault across the bridge, falling to machine gun fire as his platoon overwhelmed the bunker. Within 10 minutes, both bridges were secure. Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade landed at Sword Beach at 8 o'clock. Bagpiper Bill Millen playing Highland Laddie despite explicit orders forbidding such exposure. Ouistreham, Philippe Kiefer's Free French volunteers fought room by room through the casino strong point. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway's men stormed the Merville Battery, destroying it despite losing 450 men. By nightfall, the invasion's success was guaranteed. Representing less than 2% of the invasion force, commandos had secured every critical objective on the eastern flank. Between June 1940 and May 1945, 10,000 men served in British commando units, executing over 600 operations. They forced Germany to divert 50,000 troops to garrison duties, destroyed strategic infrastructure, and demonstrated that Nazi occupation wasn't absolute. Oberst Franz Helder never learned how catastrophically wrong his assessment had been. The intelligence reports he dismissed as impossible in November 1940 had proven devastatingly real. The commandos weren't myths, they were Britain's answer to conventional defeat. Warriors who rewrote warfare's rules and forced an empire to defend against shadows.